in for tonight's session. Since some people will be viewing these recordings that will be kept on our website, I want to introduce myself. I'm Bill Van Oss. I'm the rector at St. Michael and All Angels. I encourage you to check out our website for more information about St. Michael's and for the other Discovering the Episcopal Church sessions, the other recordings that are on our website. We've had sessions on the Bible and on the prayer book and on spirituality, and tonight's is on church history. And next week, I will do a session on church governance, sometimes called church polity, how we govern ourselves as Episcopalians. So that's next Wednesday at 6 p.m. I also encourage you to join us for worship on Saturday at 5 p.m. or Sunday at 8 or 10:30 a.m. All are welcome at St. Michael's and all are welcome to receive communion. The 10:30 service is live streamed, and that live stream link can be found on our website. Pleasure for me to introduce tonight's presenter. Reverend Alan Kelmerite is one of the assisting clergy at St. Michael and All Angels, and I'm grateful for Alan being with us tonight for church history. Alan also did the session on the prayer book, which was absolutely marvelous, and I'm sure that tonight's session is going to be equally good. So thank you very much, Alan, for being with us and for leading this session.
Thank you for our kind introduction, Bill, and hello to y'all, those of you from St. Michael's and those signed in out of curiosity for the history of the Episcopal Church. Now, I've got to confess, way back in high school, I was not a big fan of history because a lot of it was dates and names. Now, that's not so bad. I mean, that gives you sort of a flow of things. But the problem with the dates and names, there was always a test that followed, and you actually had to remember them. So I will give you dates and names as we go through this. But what I want is for you to get a sense of the flow of how and when things happened in relation to each other. Now, you've also heard me say that in order to understand anything that we're talking about at the moment, it's important to know the context. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start right back at the beginnings of the church, immediately after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. The church consisted of groups of believers who gathered together. They gathered on Sundays because that was the day of the resurrection. But they also gathered and went to worship on Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath, because by and large, initially they saw themselves as Jews who believed Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. And so they worshiped him. They met on these Sundays for prayer, discussion, early on for meals together. Eventually, that turned into communion as we know it, a shortened version of a meal, and they gathered for mutual support. Now, over time, the numbers of these believers grew, and the groups chose leaders, remembering that for the most part, they were house churches. They met in people's homes, limits to numbers of the people that could fit in. So when one house became full, another house would be started. And in each house, there would be a leader. Eventually, this became the system of priests. And then as that expanded, of bishops, of overseers as well. And so we end up with something of the church structure that we follow now. And the issue of priests and bishops has a distinct influence on the Episcopal Church, but we'll get to that. Big leap forward, 1517. Martin Luther, who was a priest in the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and really at that time, it was pretty much the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But Luther was a priest and he was a friar, but he had issues with the church. And so he nailed on the door of the church in Wittenberg 95 theses. Now that strikes us as sort of strange, nailing things to the door of the church, but in a sense, that was a sort of public bulletin board. Principal among Luther's objection was the sale of indulgences that had been announced by Pope Leo in order to fund the building of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And an indulgence was a way that a person could purchase, if you will, time off from a friend or loved one's time in purgatory before entering heaven. Luther had problems with that, and that was included in 95 Theses, but obviously he had 94 other things that concerned him as well. And that his intention was to stimulate discussion among clergy and bishops, the hierarchy of the church, discussion within the church about addressing these concerns. Well, all did not go as Luther expected. That was 1517. 3 years later, in 1520, at the Diet of Worms, please say it carefully, it's Worms, because if you do the English thing and call it the Diet of Worms, it really sounds pretty disgusting. It's Diet of Worms. The Pope ordered Luther to recant 41 of his 95 theses, of his objections. And Luther received a written notice from the Pope ordering him to recant. And the next day, Luther went out in public and burned the Pope's notice and said he refused to recant. With that, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, declared Luther an outlaw. We'll get back to the whys and wherefores of that in a little bit. But once declared an outlaw, that meant, among other things, that anyone could kill Luther without any fear of penalty at all. Luther was a friend and patronized by Frederick III, who's the Elector of Saxony. Don't worry about the terms elector and so on. That simply meant he was the guy in charge. He supported Luther because Luther was a fugitive. Frederick cooked up a scheme in which he had some of his men dressed as highway robbers seize Luther on the highway and carry him off. In reality, he carried him to Frederick's castle at Wartburg, where Luther lived until it was safer for him to go out in public. It was never completely safe. Charles never lifted his edict of Luther being an outlaw. And so Luther had to be very careful, literally, for the remainder of his life. One of the things you've got to see as you look at this is the intertwining of church and state. It had been that way for centuries, and it would continue that way at least into the late 1700s and beyond. We will see with Henry VIII, one of the common effects of that. You can't talk about the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Communion or anything else without talking about Henry VIII. If you've not had anyone tell you with sort of a sneer that, oh yeah, this is the church that Henry built. No. Henry was involved, but it is way more complicated than that. So we'll start here. Henry VIII was the second son of Henry VII, second son. And in the norms of the time, the first son inherited title and lands and wealth. The second son of nobility often went to a career in the church. usually entering at an elevated rank. And so Henry VIII prepared for a career in the church. He studied the church, he studied theology, he studied music, he studied languages. So he was not an uneducated man, nor was he ignorant of the things of the church. Henry VII's first son, Arthur, was prepared to be the king. Now, here come the names. Good luck, but here they come. Arthur married Catherine of Aragon. It was a political alliance to unite Spain and England. Arthur died of a sudden illness in 1501. He was still a teenager. Henry, a couple of years later, was betrothed to Catherine. You remember this. Henry was betrothed to Catherine. Henry then was designated to become the king, Henry VIII. And he was crowned in 1509 when he was 17 years old. Shortly after that, he married Catherine. Now, I will tell you this now. It didn't really come up until a bunch of years later. One of the things that Henry eventually talked about was a fear that it was contrary to Scripture to marry the spouse of a deceased brother. You can go back and you can read the story of, in the New Testament, of marrying Herod, the story of Herod, of marrying sister-in-law. In any case, Henry wanted a male heir. Catherine gave him 5 children, 2 boys, 3 girls. 4 of them died not much beyond childbirth. The 5th one, the girl, survived, and her name was Mary. She'll come back into the picture later. Henry became disenchanted with Catherine for a number of reasons. It was more than just a male heir. But Henry became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, who was one of the crowd of servants of Catherine. Anne Boleyn told Henry that she wanted nothing to do with him. She would not become his mistress. It was marriage or nothing. And that meant for Henry that he would have to have his marriage to Catherine annulled within the church. And here starts Henry's problem. Henry and Anne were married in 1533. Henry was still married to Catherine. Anne was already pregnant. And so the complexity of the situation starts to become clear. Henry appealed to the Pope, who by then was Clement VII, for an annulment. And whether or not that may have been granted, hard to say. But Clement was pressured by Catherine's nephew, who happened to be the Holy Roman Emperor and wielded a great deal of power, not only in his own country, but also in the papal court. And so Clement refused the annulment. At the time, Henry had Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury. Now remember, this is still the Catholic Church in England. But Henry persuaded, which wasn't very difficult to do, Cranmer to annul the marriage as Archbishop, to annul the marriage, something that was not permitted within the church, but Henry ordered it anyway. Once that was done, Parliament in England declared Henry the head of the church in England. Understand that Henry was still a Roman Catholic. And historians still argue about whether Henry or ever became Protestant or not. And many contend that Henry remained, even while he was head of the church in England, saw himself as head of the Catholic Church in England and remained Catholic to his death. At this point, it's difficult to say which is correct. But in any case, what was correct is that Henry made himself the head of the church in England. And one of the first things he did, because he was waging wars and running short of money, was to seize the property and the wealth of 800 Catholic monasteries in England. All right, there's Henry has now taken over control of the English church. As you can imagine, Henry was excommunicated by the Pope for doing that. But we'll move on. Protestantism had its ups and downs in England. Henry, we're not quite sure. His son, Edward VI, who only reigned for 6 years because he was a relatively sickly individual and a child when he became king. Edward VI had been raised Protestant, and so the church in England began to become the Church of England. Edward VI, when he died, was succeeded by Mary. Mary had been raised Roman Catholic. And so when she became queen, she began quite intentionally to restore the Roman Catholic Church in England and to eliminate Protestantism in England. Large numbers of clergy, church officials were executed under Mary, which is one of the reasons why we know her best as Bloody Mary. When Mary died, Elizabeth, who was also a daughter of Henry VIII, but had been raised Protestant, became queen, one of the longest reigning queens in England. Well, Elizabeth the Protestant, under her, ultimately the church in England became the Church of England and became a Protestant church. Cranmer was influential in the transition from the Roman Catholic Church in England to this now Protestant Church of England. You will often hear many people in the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Communion, refer to it as the via media. You got to remember, if you're in the church, you got to be a little fancy. And so you need to say these things in Latin. But it simply means middle way. A middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism. Under Elizabeth, Protestantism took some radical forms, and a Baptist radical for the time. And Elizabeth sought to find a middle ground, literally, between the two churches, a way that the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches and the Church of England could literally get along side by side. And there's truth in that, theologically and liturgically. If you look at the worship of the Anglican Communion today, the Episcopal Church and the other churches that trace their lineage to the Church of England, liturgically, they are all very similar. One of the things, I think I mentioned it when we talked about the prayer book, is that you could go to most foreign countries into an Anglican church, and whether you knew the language or not, you would recognize the service, the form of the service, because it is comparable to what we are used to. All right, so much for context. I'm supposed to quit this in 3 minutes to give you all a chance to ask a question. So does anybody have any questions yet? All right, we'll press on. Now we come to the Episcopal Church, and this is really what we're talking about, the history of the Episcopal Church. And we go back to the Revolutionary War. Now, there had, since the beginning of colonization and settlement in the New World, there had been clergy, Roman Catholic clergy, coming to the New World as missionaries. And as we get to the time of the Revolution, there were established churches pastored by missionaries from the Church of England. So we're in that middle way. And so it was in the American colonies. The Church of England continued that practice. If you read the history of what was going on then, the Methodist Church, the Baptist churches, the Lutheran Church, German Pietists, Congregationalists, all had missionaries in the 13 colonies and on the frontier. By the second half of the 18th century, the 1700s, most of the colonists remained loyal to the crown. Those living on the frontier were on a daily basis relatively free of contact with England. They still saw themselves as loyal to the crown, but their daily routine had little contact. In the cities, the royal presence was felt far more, the presence of British troops and so on. As I said, the Anglican clergy in this country were British missionaries. Some were supported by larger parishes. Others had to find secular work to help support themselves, as well as the work that they did in the churches. Also, keep in mind, because we'll come back to this in a bit, that the English clergy, as part of their ordination vows, vowed loyalty to the monarch of England. Okay, that'll become important a few more years down the line. Bishops at the time in England, of the total number of bishops, 26. Hi, Susie.
I'm giving you the signal you wanted.
Thank you. Okay, still open for questions if you would like. By the time of the Revolution, no bishops had been sent to the American colonies. And indeed, back in England, the 26 senior bishops were seated in the House of Lords, plus those who had been appointed life peers by the monarch were also seated, as the name implies, for life. And since appointment to episcopal sees was for life, they remained. As the colonists became more and more disturbed with England and frustrated and upset with, and what was the phrase, no taxation without representation, upset by the fact that they were colonies, they were expected to be loyal to the crown, but they had no voice in the British government. People who lived in England did through Parliament, but the colonies had no voice. And so by the time we get to the Revolutionary War, and we start looking at what was to become the Episcopal Church, there was a healthy skepticism of having bishops because of their noble status in England. All right. 1770s, opposition to the crown was growing. In the Anglican Church, being missionaries under vow to support, to remain loyal to the monarch, there was a split. Most of the British clergy remained loyal and either moved to Canada or set sail for England. Others stayed in the colonies. Some stayed in the colonies as loyalists, and even some of those loyalists served as chaplains in George Washington's army. But while they sided with the colonists, they remained loyal. Others of the clergy sided completely with the colonists and, in essence, renounced their vow of obedience to the king. Quick story here. I think I may have mentioned this in a sermon before, but Reverend Jonathan Boucher, an interesting guy, an extreme and ardent loyalist, to the point that he still retained the theology of the divine right of kings to rule. And his regard of the colonists' complaint, while he recognized that they were legitimate complaints, he said the colonists had no right to rebel from the king and from the crown. In 1771, Jonathan Boucher was rector of St. Barnabas Church in Upper Marlborough, Maryland, at which point he became a tutor to George Washington's son, and through that, a friend of George Washington. But as Washington became the head of the army, Boucher still remained an ardent loyalist to the crown. And he remained in his parish until 1775, when he could tolerate it no more, and he left for England. Boucher regarded his congregation, who were equally ardent patriots and uniformly opposed to Boucher's preaching of loyalty. He regarded them as potential attackers. And so for the last couple of years that he was there, Boucher would carry a pair of loaded pistols into the pulpit with him, and he would set them there in full view of the congregation, whom he believed might at any moment storm the pulpit and seize him by force. In his last sermon, when he left, he took the pistols, and as he walked towards the door, he grabbed the leader of the congregation by the collar, and he led him out of the church, and they walked at gunpoint, and they walked together to Boucher's horse, whereupon he mounted and rode off. And fortunately, no one was hurt. So they were exciting times, to say the least, for clergy and for parishes. In the Episcopal Church, the revolution left most people, Anglicans included, with the skepticism and a resentment of English royalty and nobility. And so the idea of bishops in America was not popular. However, one of the realities that soon became apparent in the Anglican Church that was forming is that without bishops, there could be no new clergy and no new bishops to carry on in the church. Well, 1783, the Revolutionary War ends. In 1784, Samuel Seabury, now remember I said there were some loyalist priests who remained in the colonies. Seabury was one of them and had been elected bishop in Connecticut after the war. And he went to England to be consecrated as bishop, because you need bishops to do that. But he was refused because of the oath to the sovereign. On two counts, Seabury did not want to take the oath, and indeed the English bishops were prohibited from consecrating anyone as bishop without that oath. So Seabury went from England to Scotland and persuaded the bishops in the Anglican Church of Scotland to consecrate him, which he did, in return for a promise that he would use the Scottish Episcopal Communion service in the American prayer book when it was assembled. And so if you look in the prayer book that we have today, what you see is quite faithful to the Scottish Communion service. 1 year later, 1785, was the first general convention of the Episcopal Church. with clergy and lay representatives from 5 states. It was 5 of the colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. And in convention, they authorized the preparation of an American prayer book. And they adopted the name, which up until relatively few years ago was the formal name of the Episcopal Church. It was the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And so they saw themselves as quite literally a Protestant church. Seabury, after he went to Scotland, was consecrated, came back to America as a bishop. Back in England, the church, the bishops there saw what had happened, and through a lot of discussion, Parliament decided that the English church could drop the requirement for an oath to the monarch for anyone who had become a bishop in a colony or a former colony. And so that change occurred communion-wide. Another year after that, 2 other American priests, Samuel Prose and William White, were consecrated by the bishops in the Church of England. And that gave the colonies, the United States, 3 bishops, which was sufficient for them to ordain clergy and to consecrate future bishops. Now, let's just take a minute to look at the structure of the Episcopal Church. It's governed by a General Convention. You've all heard of a General Convention. You've all heard of Congress in the United States. And if you look at the two, there are very strong parallels. Congress has a House of Representatives. General Convention has a House of Deputies. The makeup is different. In the House of Deputies, it's 4 clergy and 4 lay deputies. In the House of Representatives, it's based on population. Congress has a Senate. The church has a House of Bishops. The Senate consists of 2 senators from each state. In the House of Bishops, it consists of all active and retired bishops. You look in the United States, there is a president. In the Episcopal Church, there is a presiding bishop who is responsible for the leadership in developing policy and strategy for the church and in administrative oversight of national staff. A comparable role, if you will, to the President of the United States. Now, one of the things that we understand out of the way the Episcopal Church is organized is that unlike almost every other church in the Anglican Communion, the primate of the Episcopal Church, the presiding bishop, is not in a position of authority over the diocesan bishops. Okay? Not in a position of authority. Can persuade, can cajole, can bring pressure, can do a lot of things, but cannot order. Finally, the United States has a Supreme Court in session most of the year. Matters are brought to them through a chain of lower courts. The Episcopal Church has a court of review, and it deals with trials of clergy only, deacons, priests, and bishops. And it is called into session as needed. The initial steps of clerical discipline are in the local diocese. And if there is a need to go beyond that, then it is referred by the diocese to the court of review. So, what has happened in the Episcopal Church? Well, in the 1800s, Absalom Jones was ordained, the first Black priest in the Episcopal Church. General Seminary and Virginia Theological Seminary were founded to educate candidates for ordination. In England was a thing called the Oxford Movement. That's an entirely another course. Fascinating, but its sort of principal effort was to bring a higher version of liturgy back into, in their case, the Church of England, but in the commerce with the United States and the Episcopal Church, it served to restore the use of vestments for altars and clergy, candles, flowers, and it has become now what we call the Anglo-Catholic part of the Episcopal Church, traditional in liturgy and theology, although that is changing as well. One of the things you'll notice in Episcopal history is things change. Things always change. In the 1850s and 60s, we dealt with the Civil War. The Episcopal Church divided into a northern and a southern church, as did other denominations. All right, Civil War, Episcopal Church divides, as do other denominations. But if you look at denominations in this country now, after the war, the Civil War, the Episcopal Church reunited very quickly. Most of the other denominations remain divided. And so you have southern branches and northern branches still. Some other key things that happened. The Lambeth Chicago Quadrilateral was adopted. Don't even try to remember the name. But it was a statement that the Episcopal Church was open to ecumenism and to forming agreements with other denominations. And it stipulated the 4 things that were necessary for that to happen. And when they formulated that, they were also speaking about sort of a reunion with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, there is still a joint committee who studies that. We've been studying that for years, but the 4 things are the Old and New Testaments as the revealed Word of God, the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of Christian faith, the 2 sacraments established by Jesus, baptism and the Lord's Supper, ministered with the use of Christ's words of institution and of the elements ordained by him, bread and wine, and the historic episcopate locally adapted. Now, we now have such agreements with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in North America and with the Moravian Church in North America. And what that means in a practical sense is that clergy of those 3 churches are interchangeable, both for liturgy and congregational leadership. Now, there was a church in this diocese for a fair number of years, I'm thinking 10 or 12, that was a combined Episcopal Lutheran church. It is not that any longer as far as I know, but those things are possible. 1928, the prayer book was revised. And we think of revising a prayer book. We don't think of 28. But that was the new, it was the revision of the original American prayer book. And in 1940, a new hymnal was approved. And in 1944, now this is relatively recent, the presiding bishop became a full-time position. Previously, presiding bishops had remained as rectors of parishes, which will give you an idea of how limited their time was to do things of either the parish or the church. So 44 became full-time. Okay, here we come to some major changes. In the 1960s, modern translations of the Bible started to become published and readily available. A Revised Standard Version being amongst the first. So by the 1970s, there was pressure within the Episcopal Church to update the King James English, because people were used to this now in their scripture translations, but to update the King James English in the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. And so through the 70s, you may remember them. They were paperback books in blue, yellow, and green, if I remember right, trial liturgies. And they produced, again, I was not in the Episcopal Church at the time, so to me, this is hearsay. For those of you that were, you may remember the skirmishes in the congregations of people who wanted to continue the 28 prayer book, people who liked the modern liturgies. The new prayer book, the 79 prayer book, was approved after 2 readings at General Convention. It's after all of these trial liturgies. The book was put together, it was presented twice at General Convention and approved. Now, in the 28 prayer book, there was a single liturgy for the daily offices, for the Eucharist, and King James English. The 79 prayer book has something for everyone. Now, I don't know this for a fact because I was not in the Episcopal Church at the time. I suspect a lot of the way that 79 prayer book has come out was an effort literally to provide something for everyone. So you have Rite 1, King James English. You have Rite 2, contemporary language. Rite 2, and you have both of those rites in the daily offices, morning prayer, evening prayer, and you have them in the Eucharist. Now, in the Rite 1 Eucharist, King James English, there are 2 versions of the Eucharistic prayer. That is the second half of the service. One is longer and one is shorter. I'm not even going to speculate why that was done. I have my suspicions, but some of you may know. In the Rite 2 service, Rite 2 Eucharist, it is contemporary language, but there are 4 Eucharistic prayer options, which are different in style as well as in language. Some that are very contemporary, some that the folks who worked and studied to put this book together dug far back into the history of the church. And by far back, I mean to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So that is the book that we have now. Now that's in the 70s. 79 is the book. 1974, women were not permitted to be ordained by the canon law of the Episcopal Church. However, in 1974, 11 women were ordained. And 2 years later, their ordinations were regularized at General Convention. 1989, the first woman was elected bishop. And in 2006, with Catherine Jeffers Shorey, the first woman was elected as presiding bishop. 2012, this is to give you a sense of changes in how they're going. General Convention approved for trial use liturgies for same-sex blessings. Blessings is an important word in that sense because General Convention has not really addressed same-sex marriage. They have more or less left that to the states and to secular law, but they have approved a trial liturgy for same-sex blessings. And so here we are, 2021. There are divisions in the church over issues of theology, over issues of liturgy. And, you know, I've been in the Episcopal Church since 1989 or 90. Those differences have not always been dealt with grace and love. But the church continues. Conclusion. there have been and will continue to be many changes in the Episcopal Church, as there are in virtually every other denomination and church as well. It will continue to change. It is my prognostication, my prediction, that the theological changes will be the most difficult because they involve people's deep-seated beliefs. So the challenge, I think, in the future as we move on from this history will be to hold the church together through these changes. And I would close simply with this, a question asked by Richard Niebuhr. Believe me, I'm paraphrasing this. It's from his book, Christ and Culture. But the question is, should the church follow culture or should the church lead the culture to God? It's a great oversimplification. But his answer to that is that the role of the church is to transform the culture in which it is set, to bring it closer to faith in Jesus Christ. Well, I told you at the beginning, I was not a really good history student in high school and not so much in college until I picked up years later an historical novel about moving to the Western frontier, which of course at the time was Western New York. And it was a fascinating book, fascinating story. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that it was an historical story. It was accurate and factual. And history sort of came alive for me then. And I was blessed in seminary with an amazing professor of history. He was one who could make history literally come alive in the classroom. So I like it. And I trust you will forgive me for all the dates and names and the, as I said before, the high-speed, low-level pass over this subject. But hopefully that will give you some idea of the flow of how things have gone to bring us to where we are today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Appreciate your presentation tonight. Thank you,
Thank you all.
everybody,
Thank you, Bill.
for zooming in. I hope you will zoom in again next Wednesday, same time, for a little session on our Episcopal Church's polity and how we govern ourselves.
That'll be interesting.
Mhm.